my favorite philosopher, pointed out that we should concentrate more on what's socially needed and avoid so-called vain virtues and customs like fasting, chastity, celibacy, and all other forms of individual bigotry, which are not contributing to social well-being, and sometimes can be even harmful for the whole of society. He thought that because long-term debauchery is bad for health, men should apply some basis restrictions, and Jesus is not required, right? Only medical restrictions are sufficient. Holbach observed that no one will respect a liar because no one will trust him. And also, God is not needed for make this simple and very true notion. On the contrary, adding God to this equation makes it only stranger to understand and less clear. Voltaire has had benign political views and radical religious ones. He believed that the form of government is not as important as the general rule that people have the right to choose for themselves. That's why he campaigned for Calas, Sylvain, and the others persecuted for their personal religious beliefs in France. Not only France, he was also involved in the case of Admiral Byng in England. And Voltaire said, no. Liberty is the ability to act without obstacles, right? It's a state of things, not some psychological power over yourself. And Voltaire had relatively or good relations with kings and ministers. He has influenced many kings like Frederick the Great, Gustav III of Sweden, Joseph II Habsburg, Joseph I of Portugal, the protector of the Minister of Pombal. And he and many ministers like Choiseul, Struensee in Denmark, Florida Blanca in Spain, and other persons of influence like Marquess de Pompadour and so on. Some of the monarchs didn't listen to this advice, but tried to appear like they were listening. The famous examples are Catherine the Great and Louis XV. So Voltaire made tolerance and liberal thinking fashionable. It's the very, very good quality indeed in Voltaire's thought. In the 19th century, Enlightenment champions of freedom and toleration had to face many problems. The 19th century was the age of democracy and of course populism. 19th century was also the age of nationalism and socialism, and the growth of maybe even overgrowth of the power of states. Some of them warned us about the threat of radical democracy. Radical democracy for uneducated masses who are not accustomed to think about politics every day, and they should be accustomed to that if we would have good democracy. The first who thought about it and wrote about it was, I think, in a broader sense, Jefferson, but in 19th century it became very fashionable, very valid topic. Alexis de Tocqueville talked about it, Benjamin Constant, José Ortega y Gasset in Spain. Some of the others criticized the nationalistic fate of Europe. Humboldt, for instance, he said that liberty shouldn't be so closely tied to nationalism, and it was the case in the 19th century because on one hand there were these kings who were so cosmopolitan in their views. So if liberal thinkers, liberal politicians wanted to overthrow them, they had to make an alliance with nationalism. And that was a bad thing according to Humboldt, and he was definitely right, I think. John Stuart Mill observed that that there is something like social taboo, and sometimes it's like additional apparatus of censorship. It's that it's not sufficient to liquidate the official censorship of the press, newspapers, and media, but you also have this social taboo, which sometimes is even stronger. For instance, my favorite example is John Milton in the 17th century England. A little bit maybe far from Mill, but I think it's a good example. Mill was all in favor, and he was one of the first authors who said many things about the importance of the free press and free public opinion. At the same time, he was for censorship and for totally liquidations of theaters, because he found them, the theatrical pieces, he found them something, well, abomination or something, right? So wanted to liquidate one part of free expression, but was standing for other part. Of course, that we can find elements of secular and liberal thinking in other cultures, non-European, non-Western cultures. But about that I will say a few words later. The other problem is that the main branch of Enlightenment movement, the liberal branch of that movement, is simply universal. It's an example of universal thought, universal social thought. So we should always remember that Enlightenment implicates universal thought. This universal thought that every man could be freed from the chain of tradition and culture. Once again, chain of tradition and culture, it's very unfashionable talk these days, where we have, the Heritage Foundation, we have the huge postmodernistic movements at all universities, very fashionable indeed. And whereas liberals and all disciples of the Enlightenment movement think universally. Even at the liberal conferences, they are all talking about cultural context, and I will stand against that today. Liberals think that there is a basic model of human being independent from cultural context, that there are some basic human needs and virtues everywhere, in every man and woman. And of course, this way of thinking is today under attack from conservatives. Conservatives are old and easy enemy, because conservatives are all about, very particular tradition, very particular culture, very particular history. They are not universal. The other threat is, of course, the religion. Religion, sometimes some religions are more universal, some are more particular. We have national religions, like Shinto in Japan, or maybe Judaism is also, an example. The enemy, of course, is postmodernism. And as Jacek said in his speech, that he recalls a discussion in radio with a priest and a postmodernistic thinker, publicist, something, columnist, I don't know. I had very similar experience. And also I sided with the priest, because at least I knew what he stands for, And we are talking about, as I recall, if this is a good thing or a bad thing, then more and more Poles are becoming non-believers, atheists or something. And the priest said, well, I don't know if it's a good thing, good direction, but something. I said that yes, it's a good direction. And the postmodernistic thing said, I don't like directions. I don't like directions. So what he was basically standing for, right? Nothing. Fun of discussion for discussion? I know. The postmodernists usually say that every narrative is equal. I think it's some sort of giving up. Like, you know, we are living in a multicultural world, and of course we think differently, but, you know, just to state that all these ways of thinking are equal, it's like giving up. We should convince each other, right? Not by force, of course, by discussion. That's the normal state of things, but it's sort of obvious that when we have so many multicultural experience these days in our times, that such way of thinking would appear, right? That we should give up and think, okay, there's no one truth, there's no one value, and so on. Now back to the text a little bit. Liberty and enlightenment is not simply a Western concept, it's the other. Of course, it evolved under European and American sun, and its name, enlightenment, was also used and coined in the Western world. But we can perceive the benign power of enlightenment also in Japan of Meiji period, for instance, or even earlier. By the way, Meiji means enlightened period, enlightened era. But also we can perceive it earlier, also in Japan, in the tradition of Rangaku. Rangaku means Dutch knowledge, Dutch science. The Japanese, they have limited the experience of the cultural contact with the Westerners only to Dutch. They opened the harbor in Nagasaki, they made the artificial isle for them, and they were interested, some of the Japanese thinkers were interested in Dutch, and through Dutch to European culture and science. Of course, the Japanese wouldn't know the difference, so there were many Germans and Swedes also on that isle, and who were provided with the opportunity to study Japanese culture as well. So it worked both ways. Well, very secular. When Confucius was asked once by one of his disciples what he has to say about death, he said, "You don't understand life, how you will understand death?" So I won't say anything about death, it's absurd, right? It's just the end of life. Very secular indeed. And also as gives the opportunity to avoid on religious implications. That's why when the Jesuits came to China, they had only to deal not with the Chinese tradesmen of the south, who were Taoists, right? But mostly with the aristocracy, the mandarins, and they were all, well, they stand for Confucianism. Instead, the Chinese, the Chinese, they have no religion, so great territory to expand Christian thought. Also observe some elements of enlightened, secular, liberal thinking in Taoism and Legism, Legism is unfortunately a forgotten ancient Chinese philosophy, which was very close to the practical philosophy, as Peter Gay, one of the English specialists, writing about Enlightenment, he called the Enlightenment period was the time of practical philosophers, and Legism was very close to that. We can also see liberal thinking, but it was mostly implemented from Western philosophies in the liberal democratic revolution in China in 1911, but it was swiftly intercepted by nationalists, so doesn't really count. And we can also see in ancient traditions of the great Indian King Ashoka. So those who claim that the Chinese, for instance, they are naturally authoritarian, and this is a very famous, very typical claim that they are all Confucianists and they should be authoritarian, that they can only be happy, right, under autocratic regime. Those claims are false. Just take a look at Taiwan. Like, you have liberal Chinese. And just to look at the history of the southern China with all these Taoist and liberal thinking tradesmen. And that's why the today's image of China in Great Britain and United Kingdom and France are different. We also can see some elements of enlightenment in the Turkey of the era of Ahmed III. It was the sort of the era of tulips, era of tulips, right? The flower. And we can also see in Tunisia, in Jordan, in many parts of the Muslim world as well, but they are mostly adapted from Western way of thinking philosophy. For instance, I think the Western politicians are more to blame here because they sacrifice Western ideas. Of course, not all believe in them. There are many conservatives, right? And I know radical leftists and so on. They don't believe in those traditions. And they prefer to have these trade deals more than to state simple standards and so on. Sarkozy was the first French president who created the post of Undersecretary for Human Rights. And this was, and also was the first president who marginalized this this post because he wanted to have these trade deals. Angela Merkel was a little bit more successful with in dealing with China because German trade deals are bigger and more important for the Chinese economy. Enlightenment has no problem at all with religion, provided that religion is a private thing. Right? If we perceive that religion is something private, that shouldn't be, politically used. So, and no one can be forced politically to agree to some religious concept, then Enlightenment has no problem with religion at all. So liberty requires secularism in public sphere. That's as simple as that. Of course, not the pretended communist secularism of the USSR, when Marxism was playing the role of religion, but the real benign secularism in public sphere. Nice discussions in which Buddhists and Christians took part. Of course, what always lacks in Asia for this, as far as Enlightenment is concerned, is the lack of universalism. Because Japan and China traditionally believe that Japanese thought and Chinese thought are for the Chinese and for the Japanese, not for the other nations. The West combines liberal thought with the Christian zeal for evangelization. So, if we want to think universally, we need this zeal for evangelization, because otherwise who would care, yeah? Who would care what... nice discussions with... later, Christian Wolff and Gotthold Ephraim Lessing observed that the European religious practice and thought should be improved by pouring some liberal elements into it. Diplomats from Europe got in touch with the non-European cultures and learned to make universalism of European thought more open to diversity of the world. This is very important because in the 18th century the word civilization was coined. and there was only one civilization. We are now taught about many civilizations, and if you want to stay enlightened and liberal, you just need to accept that there is only one civilization, because the needs, they can be not taught in schools, right, in China or Russia, but the basic elements are universal. And this contact with the non-European cultures was very important, because when, for instance, French diplomats traveled in the late 17th century to Siam, which is Thailand, of course, today, and they had to do with the very peculiar, very exotic, of course, from their point of view, religious rituals, but they also observed that the Siamese, they behaved very properly, very morally, and they were shocked. Oh. And this contact is really, really, really important, because after all, in the 15th century, for instance, in the Central Eastern European part of the world, in the Central Eastern Europe, kings, they didn't know, even kings, they didn't know that there are other races. Yeah? Of course, the modern science tells us that there are no races. The genetic models of human genome does not support the theory of races, and that's true. But I only need this example to stress how big the difference is when you see real people looking totally different and so on. Observed that all conflicts are man-made. So all politics is man-made. We are not doomed to conduct wars against each other. So we really can do some rational politics. It's not our fate to have wars against each other. Then we had the observation of Pierre Bayle. Pierre Bayle has observed that it's not religion what makes people moral. It's the police force. And that's true. Yes, so without a good police force, there's nothing God can do for public safety. Christian Thomasius, Baruch Spinoza, John Locke, David Hume, and Voltaire, they understood that we need better, more liberal and individualistic, more universal decalogues. Thomasius and Wolff observed liberal elements in the tradition of East Asia, which gave the European Enlightenment more universal ground. Locke understood that private, by the way, Wolff was banned from Prussia for stating that the Chinese are equally moral to the Europeans. It was banned by the king Frederick William I, who was deeply involved in the pietist movement and couldn't suffer this notion. Of course, the Frederick II, Frederick the Great, has invited him again. That's a nice thing to do. Okay, and as far as Locke is concerned, Locke understood that private sphere should be free from oppression and forcing. Locke wasn't really very universal. He had some restrictions about Catholics, because he was under the impression, it was very common in those time, dynasty in England, using French money and papal money.